Hey, hello everyone. Today, the topic we're going to be covering is cohort studies. So, there are two main types of cohort studies, prospective and retrospective. And I invited a very special guest. Um, Her name is Dr. Leigh Vanderloo. She's a knowledge translation manager for national nonprofit organization ParticipACTION. So, welcome, Leigh, to our podcast.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leigh, for having me. Super happy to be here and talk about cohort studies and how I've been using them a lot in my research recently.
Yay! Well, thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure my students will appreciate having you as well. So we're very excited. So before we begin and talk about cohort studies, do you want to introduce yourself to our students?
Yeah, sure. I can give a little bit of a brief bio. As Dr. Leigh mentioned, I'm currently working as the Knowledge Translation Manager at ParticipACTION, and our main goal is to really help support more active behaviors among Canadians, regardless of age, gender, or ability, as well as helping to support a decrease in sedentary behaviors. So how I got there was my background. I did my bachelor's, was an honor specialization in health sciences and a minor in French. I then went on to do my master's in public health and health promotion, where I really focused more so on obesity and looking at environmental impacts on that and how do we kind of create a more supportive environment and how do we help support healthy behavior change to help with any items that are related or factors related to obesity and looking at that the differences between an obesogenic versus a leptogenic environment. I then started to shift based on some of the work I was doing as a research assistant around children and looking at the community and trying to focus a little bit more on physical activity. I decided to do my PhD at Western, and my PhD was specifically in pediatric exercise science. And so that really allowed me to take a deeper dive into what does physical activity and exercise look like in young kids. So I decided to focus on the early years, so under 5. So how does that look like for an infant versus a toddler versus a preschooler? How do we accurately measure physical activity in such a young group? So we're not going to be asking them to get on a treadmill and measure that. So what does that look like and what's the best way to measure it in such young kids? Because we know that even as an infant, they need to be active, but what does vigorous activity look like for, an infant when they can barely crawl and you're doing active tummy time versus, a preschooler that's now, has good control over their gross motor skills and are more ambulatory. So that's what I ended up focusing on for my PhD, looking at the childcare environment as well. So not just how active they are, but where are they getting active and how can we ensure that those environments are conducive to more active and less sedentary behaviors. So I defended my PhD on a Wednesday. I interviewed for the job at ParticipACTION on Friday, and I got hired on Monday in Toronto.
Wow.
So I had a very, very quick transition. I was actually hoping I was going to be able to take a couple months off and do nothing, maybe because I was a student for so long. And I figured this would be that one time that I'd have that carte blanche of just being like, I can travel, I can do nothing if that's what I want to do. Now's the time. Didn't work out that way, but I am happy that I was able to get a job. So I moved to Toronto and started working at ParticipACTION. And so my main role there is really to ensure that all of the evidence and research that keeps getting published on, physical activity and what does that mean, and ensuring that we're able to package it in a way that's a lot more public facing and lay friendly. So, yourselves as students that sometimes when you're reading journal articles, you have a better understanding of what they're because it's what you're studying, you're familiar with this terminology, but you also have this appreciation for the fact that it is sometimes quite technical and that if you're explaining it to someone who's maybe not in your program, there is that kind of barrier in terms of how accessible that information is. And so that's really what my role is, to ensure that we're finding a way to really seamlessly get that more technical information into the hands of the people that are best able to do something with it, being organizations that help support families in Canada or individuals, or the actual individuals themselves, so maybe parents, teens, so that they are aware of how active they're supposed to be. How do you get active? How do you self-monitor your behaviors? And trying to find more creative ways to kind of package that information. So that's kind of my main role at ParticipACTION, if I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it, and really just serve as the subject matter expert, so that everything we do put out, we do a lot of marketing material, social marketing initiatives. So just ensuring that everything we're putting forward is, fact-checked, it's evidence-based, it's rooted in the current best available research that we know, and working and really collaborating with a number of other experts in the field, organizations, just to really ensure that we're putting that best information forward, or we're serving as that conduit. So yeah, that's pretty much, I guess I would say, in terms of what I do at ParticipACTION. I also have a cross appointment at Sick Kids Hospital, where I was serving as a research fellow there within the Child Health and Evaluative Sciences department in their division of pediatrics. And so my main role there was, again, looking at the impact of movement behaviors, specifically screen use and physical activity, on various health outcomes, either from a mental health or cognition perspective, or to cardiometabolic issues. And so that's where I really started to dig into this whole area of cohort studies, because that is primarily everything that we do in our lab. There being a member of one of the largest child health cohorts in the country. So we can definitely talk a little bit more about that later on, but in a nutshell, that's kind of what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it sounds like you have to wear so many hats.
Yes, it is.
Your work.
It is a lot at times, but at the same time, I try to appreciate the fact that I get to serve as both someone that helps generate new knowledge, but also try to find creative or innovative ways to disseminate that knowledge. So I get to kind of work on both those domains, which I think in the end is going to make me a stronger researcher, because it's going to make me think through. It's not just enough to produce that new knowledge, but how am I going to ensure that it's advancing what we're doing in practice? So at least that's the goal.
Yeah, for sure. Because our last topic of this course is knowledge translation, and in that conversation, I speak on how much researchers lack in knowledge translation skills. The only thing that we do maybe is to publishing a peer-reviewed paper or presenting our study at a conference, at an academic conference, right?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. We're not trained to do that. I think when we think of knowledge translation, it's exactly that. We check that box. So it's okay, I've published it, or I've presented it to my colleagues in an academic setting. So it's more of that passive knowledge translation. We're still disseminating it, but it's definitely a more passive route. And we can see inherently that it doesn't really move beyond our group, in that it kind of stays. When we go to a conference, who do we present it to? Other researchers and clinicians that already have an invested interest in what we're doing, but it doesn't go there. So I think it's further challenging in that now when we apply for funding for grants, or either other forms of project funding, is that we're now being asked to put forward some sort of detailed integrative knowledge translation plan. But it's not just enough to say, oh yeah, we'll do KT, or we'll publish, in a couple open access journals. Is that these funders want to see some plan, and it's very hard because many of us do not have that training on how can we even propose a plan, let alone actually execute or operationalize that plan. And so I think it is demonstrating that it's not just enough to be a researcher in your domain, but to also think about, implications, or bringing on some sort of expert in KT when you're thinking of putting together a research team.
Yeah, and that speaks to how versatile you are as a researcher. You're a knowledge translation manager, but at the same time, I know your PhD dissertation work. You've been participating in reviews, cross-sectional studies, and now we're going to be talking about cohort studies based on a paper that you recently published. So yeah, it's awesome that we have you to speak about cohort studies today. It's
Thanks.
it's like we are getting everything in one package.
Well, I'm happy to be here and to pay it forward. I'm flattered that you wanted me to come and speak with your group. So, yeah, and I mean, I spent so many years as a student, same with yourself, being a trainee, and some things are amazing about it and other things not so great. So I'm happy to finally, after many years, be in a position that I can now pay it forward. And I feel that I
Yeah.
was fortunate that I had a lot of mentors that were, close in age to me that were still ahead of me, but that I could really draw on for, helping me on whatever my career path was. Like, I actually wanted to be a French immersion elementary school teacher. So I definitely, went way, way away from that. I knew I liked kids and I knew I liked science. So I kind of thought
Mm-hmm.
that's what I would end up in. So I still feel in a roundabout way that I got to do that. I'm still in science and my research is on kids. So I feel in a way I still kind of got that, but yeah, like definitely took a huge derailment in terms of my original plans of what I thought
Yeah.
I'd be when I grow up.
Yeah, but as I speak with other people for this podcast, I find that everyone took a really interesting route, and they just say it like, "Oh, I never imagined myself being here," including myself. So it's really interesting how everything, like the life, just takes you to where you are right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think I started viewing time spent in school very differently. Like, obviously, as you get older, you get wiser. You like to think you do, and you've learned from that. But yeah, in my third year of my undergrad, I was speaking to one of the academic counselors, just making sure, I'm all en route to like graduate and do all that. And I thought health sciences with my French were both teachables, but because health sciences was a newer program at the university at that time, it wasn't being recognized yet. If I was in medical science or just one of the applied sciences, it was. And so it was kind of like the news was broke to me, like, no problem, you might just have to come back for another term or a year. And at that time, I was like, well, absolutely not. I am not spending more than I need to in school. And I was just like, nope, I'm done. Like, I will finish out my undergrad and, I'll think of something else or I'll find another way. And then just happened that in that summer, I got a job working, doing research for
Mm-hmm.
who ended up becoming my PhD supervisor in the end. But it was completely different from what I thought research was. I thought it was going to be, in a lab with a microscope and I was going to be by myself all the time. And while that work is so incredibly important and very admirable, I just knew that that wouldn't be a setting that I think I would flourish in, we'll say. And so I think that completely switched in my mind what research is, what it could be, the impact that I could have with the type of
Mm-hmm.
work that I was doing. And yeah, after that, I decided to like, no, I think I'd never entertained grad school. I don't even think I fully maybe understood what grad school was. Like, I think I knew like professional schools, but not really that. And I started, yeah, completely switched. I remember telling my parents, like, I could be in school like another 6 years. And they were like, what? Like, you didn't even want to do another 4 months. And they were like, are you sure? And I'm sure they had like internal conversations among themselves, being like, I don't
Mm.
know if what Leigh's doing is the best thing, but yeah, like here I am. So I'm very fortunate for the path and the people I kind of had like before me, and especially being a female, I think, in academia and a science kind of field rather than some of the other fields. I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to come across so many other really like strong female academics or researchers that kind of forge the way, and a variety, some of them having families and having great family lives and still being stellar academics and professors. And for me, that was really important because those are all the things that I have and that I want as well. And so yeah, so I think, like you said, for some reason, wherever the twists and turns like took me all along these few years to like, yeah, I feel very happy and thankful for where I've arrived today.
Yeah. Wow. Now I want to talk about something else than cohort studies. So much more interesting to talk about women in academia. Yeah.
Definitely have to have another chat about that. Some of our
Yeah.
other colleagues, and yeah, have a little panel on that in terms of what it was
Yeah.
like, especially being younger females too. I find you don't just have the gender aspect, but I find sometimes the age factor comes in too.
For
So
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now I guess we have to talk about cohort studies.
Cohorts.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. So
yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
So I mean, I assume, or maybe not at this time, maybe cohort studies were very new to you this first time. Coming into it, that maybe you didn't know. I know there's a lot of different study design types. You might have heard of some like cross-sectional or longitudinal case control studies. So really for cohort studies, in a nutshell, it's very much just we're looking at a selected or specific population over an extended period of time. And so they can be two different types. So we either have the retrospective or the prospective. And so when I always like to think, or when I'm explaining, is that, present time, that's when we see those cross-sectional, that's that snapshot right in time. But when we want to take that retrospective look, we're going to be looking from present back. So we're going to be taking that kind of historical perspective of, what might have occurred in the past that has now led us to where we are today. Whereas when we're looking at prospective, we're kind of doing the opposite end of the spectrum. So we're looking at everything that happened maybe now or in whatever our starting time was, depending on your study and what you want to deem as that kind of starting point, all the way to more of that future look. So what might have happened, now, or, when kids were 3 and leading up to future, what are we expecting or what might we find? So those are the main two types of cohort studies. So there is some similarities when we think of cross-sectional in that, we have this exposure, we have this outcome, but the beauty or those advantages that kind of come with a cohort study is the fact that we're looking at them repeatedly over an extended period of time. And so sometimes, depending on the journal that you're submitting with, or that you might have read something, so maybe you have a study and you're looking at it, that sometimes if it's not saying prospective cohort studies, sometimes you might see them use the term like repeated cross-sectional study. And depending on your school of thought, some people might say like no such a thing than if you're saying repeated cross-sectional, but essentially, in a sense, you're kind of looking at that. If you have those repeated measures over time, if you're looking from a starting to that future point, whatever that might be, is that there is that sense. So sometimes, whatever way helps you conceptualize or better differentiate between what's a retrospective or a prospective. That's sometimes how I think, or when I'm trying to determine, what study design am I going to be using, or for writing out a new project grant, really what we're trying to look at. So if we want to look at some of the advantages and disadvantages, I mean, every study design has some pluses and minuses. And so obviously I'm a bit biased when it comes to cohort studies because I very much openly embrace them. They're great in the sense of you get to look at a particular population over an extended period of time. So you get that, you have that advantage of having time on your side, that temporal precedence that you get to kind of look at, whether you're looking at backwards into the past, so that historical, that retrospective, or you're looking forward and kind of seeing, something that happened now, what's the likelihood of, X happening in the future. Oftentimes you're going to be able to look at a number of different health issues all at once. And so, we'll talk a little bit about Target Kids that I'm a part of, as well as the study that I put. But again, we were looking at kids from birth all the way up until 18. And we have every year we're collecting a number of different health data off them via questionnaires versus blood work, anthropometric measurements. And so this really opens it up for us to look at like a huge number of different health issues of outcomes and exposures. And, in my work and in my particular study, it was looking at their activity levels at a young age between 3 to 12, and what's the likelihood or the association with them now having some sort of cardiometabolic issue. And so that's kind of what we looked at, but that was just one of many things that we could have looked at. So the beauty of having that is that we're able to look at a number of different issues all at once. We have that temporal thing. It also allows us to maybe look at some really rare or more unique health conditions, because we do have that historical perspective. But of course, with all the things that make the study design great, It also lends itself to, those are also some of the most notable disadvantages. So one is it can be costly. So it can be quite expensive to maintain a really rigorous and powerful cohort study. And so when I think of even some of the work we've done at Sick Kids Hospital within Target Kids, multi-million dollars in terms of setting it up and making sure that we can follow tens of thousands of kids, hopefully from birth all the way until 18. And so with Target Kids, we are now entering our 11th year of the cohort. So from the very first time, which is great. We do have about 20,000 kids that we've been following that long and have like their repeated measures. But it is very expensive. It's very costly. And it's not just from a participant perspective, but it's also from the research staff, the various clinics that we have on board to run with it. So there's a lot of moving parts. And so it can be pretty pricey and to keep it going. So of course, cohort, it's longitudinal. We're trying to keep it going longer. The cohort study is only as good for as long as we can keep it going. So that can be hard. Also ensuring like accuracy of data collection, especially if you're doing retrospective studies, it's hard to get people to necessarily recall what they were doing. So you want to make sure that you constantly have that kind of good, solid data collection all the way through. This is often why we see more prospective cohort studies than retrospective, because it is sometimes harder to get that historical thing if we don't have good records from the get-go. And being mindful of like, as we adapt and start changing things moving forward, does that make some of the stuff we collected previously maybe not as good, or are we not going to be able to use it to compare? And then the other big thing is just participant dropout. I think when we're trying to deal with that, and we've had that ourselves, maybe we have followed a certain child for 5 years, but we're now in our 11th year and we only have 5 years worth of data. Whereas for some of them, we're hoping to have that full gamut. And it's also not just for the years, but it also could be for some of the data. So let's say we're collecting health data on, 20 different things. So their movement, behavior, nutrition, how many visits they might have had to the doctor's office, how many times they had a upper respiratory infection, their blood work, so looking at their lipid profiles, all of that. But let's say, some of the years they didn't have all 20 complete sets. Maybe they only have blood for, 6 of the 11 years or that. So that also gives us gaps. And so while we're able to look at a lot, sometimes you do have to, your sample size can sometimes be impacted because we sometimes have to remove a lot of participants. If I'm looking at, say, their physical activity, and I only have that 70% actually provided physical activity data for all the years that I'm looking at, I'm going to have to remove. If I can't do something from a statistical standpoint, such as some sort of imputation, if I can't for whatever reason, then that could potentially be a huge chunk of the sample that I actually have to remove. And so sometimes it might limit some of the findings, the strength, whether or not I find anything. Is it dependent on because there really wasn't an association, or is it more, impacted by the sample size? And then lastly, if you are looking at some of those more rare conditions, depending on what you are, sometimes you need a really large sample size to do that. And again, if you are losing participants to dropout over the years, people move. Sometimes the parents are no longer interested in participating. Sometimes they just forget to come in or don't have the time. COVID, for example, was definitely a huge thing in terms of how do we keep it going when, they could do the survey portions, but all of the other portions that we would need them to come into clinic and do, we couldn't do. So how are we going to handle, 2020, 2021, its impact on our data collection? So those are definitely some things that we always have to keep or be mindful of, and certainly have become limitations for us. Is there anything else, maybe any other things that you've maybe encountered, Dr. Leigh, in terms of anything with regards to advantages or disadvantages?
No, I think you've covered pretty much everything, all the important things. So Dr. Vanderloo just mentioned that the key aspects of retrospective and prospective cohort studies and how the cohort makes up for a research project. Also advantages and disadvantages associated with cohort studies. And I want to highlight one thing. So you mentioned the temporal sequence of cohort studies being one of the uh, advantages of the study design. And we talked about causality, establishing causality in epidemiology course previously, and temporality is the most important one to consider when we are determining causal associations between an exposure and outcome. So can you speak a little bit more about that temporal sequence? Like, what do you mean by temporal sequence, and how do you establish that in cohort studies?
Yeah, so for that, it is really important, like the timing of when that collection is. And so again, for a lot of my work, the movement behaviors, and let's say I'm looking at screen use and cardiometabolic risk. So, if they had a lot of exposure to screen use growing up or from a young age, is heavy screen use from a young age predictive or associated with, high blood pressure in later childhood, for example? Since I can speak to that, since I studied that. But for that it was really important that we ensured that every time for all of our children, our participants in the study, is that the exposure had to precede when the outcome measure would have been. So it had to ensure that for every child that we wanted to include and all of their data, we had to look and ensure that the time for that year, or whatever the date range was that we were looking at, is that their screen viewing data, so their exposure, was collected before we would have had all of their blood work and blood pressure collected. And so that's where it became really important, especially if we wanted to get into that whole inferring causality. Any claims that we wanted to make, it was really important that happened, because if they were switched, or if they weren't, because it's very possible that and there are cases where that happened, that, they didn't get their questionnaire done, so they returned it, a month or something after they had their clinic visit. And so it's important for us to have everything date stamped, because we couldn't. So that from a temporal perspective, if that had been switched, or if we didn't know, or if it was done at the exact same time, it would have been really hard if we had included them, that we would have been able to infer causality for that particular relationship that we were looking at.
So information on the exposure should be obtained before we collect information about the outcome. Usually, how long is long enough to get that information, you think?
Yeah, so I would say that it varies in terms of what you're looking at. So what health behaviors. So for us, we typically try to ensure that there were months between, for us, especially because of the type of relationship that I was looking at. So when we have stuff around cardiometabolic risk and movement behaviors, they're quite sensitive to that. And so it was important that we wanted to make sure there was enough time between. So I usually took that I wanted them at least, if I could, and for the majority, like at least 70-80%, I could get that I had at least about 4 to 6 months between when I collected or when the data was collected. It's not always the case. So I've definitely seen some that have been much shorter, that have just been by a couple weeks, especially some that have been around growth trajectories. So when their BMI might have been taking, or other kind of adiposity measures, if they would have done something more in a bod pod and we're looking for lean body mass, that, and then we've had some sort of other outcomes such as breastfeeding, for example. It's possible that their breastfeeding could have been done within weeks, or it could have been within years. So they could have been looking at, the breastfeeding that they had, in their first 1 to 2 years of life versus, now a school age child, and what impact that has had on their adiposity. So it does kind of vary, but you don't want it in terms of, or at least in my experience, or what I've read, is that when we say this has to happen before, it's not so much like on the same day that I just happen to take their physical activity measurements, and then, about an hour later, we did their blood work. That's not, there might be some extent, but as far as I know, like, we want a good enough amount of time so that they're kind of mutually suited, that there isn't that overlap. So I think that's something important, because technically you could collect one before the other, but within a matter of minutes or hours.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree that it can be case specific. So for movement behavior in the early years and their cardiometabolic health, of course, there's that sensitivity and rapid changes in growing child. So the time frame could be, like you said, 4 to 6 weeks would be good enough to capture that information. But if it's a adult cohort, so for example, like nurses studies or Harvard alumni studies or Framingham studies, then we are just following people up, and let's say we want to see the incidence of type 2 diabetes as people get older, then we may need 20-30 years to
absolutely
get
and we're seeing that a lot also with like adverse childhood experiences, so like ACEs. What happened, were you growing up, were you subjected to maybe poverty or intimate partner violence, like witnessing it between your say your mom and a potential partner. So having to move all of these different things, maybe you were subjected to bullying or abuse yourself, or either a sickness, so some kids that had received cancer diagnoses when they were really young. And then what has that impact had on their overall health as a teen or adult? And we're seeing that a lot of, at least some preliminary stuff is depending on the outcome that we're looking at, but say mental health, for example. If we do some of those retrospective, it's not unexpected that we wouldn't see that growing up, they, did encounter some form of adverse childhood experience. And so that would be a perfect example where, there could be years, decades between when we would have had that exposure data collected versus when the outcome.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one thing that we covered in this course is bias and confounding. And one of the things that we can do during the data analysis stage is to control for confounders. So you've mentioned about your paper as an example while touching on cohort study design's key aspects, advantages and disadvantages. So can you tell us a little bit about your study with the focus on like confounders, so covariates that were controlled?
Yeah, so I guess like before that, I would mention that one other, just you remind me about biases, that can also be an additional disadvantage sometimes to cohort studies, and that sometimes selection bias can become, it could be an issue or limitation in terms of not falling into that pitfall where we kind of cherry pick only the ones that have, these perfect cases or are perfect participants that have everything. So definitely selection bias, or if we're looking for certain things, sometimes that can become a noted barrier. It's not one that I've encountered. And again, it could be because of how the cohort that I work with is currently set up. But I know I've seen it before noted as limitations, or just something to at least be aware of if you are doing that, not to kind of fall victim to selection bias. But yeah, so basically in terms of from a covariate or confounding perspective for our study that we looked at, is there an association between physical activity and cardiometabolic risk for kids between 3 and 12? What we had controlled for was things such as age, sex, maternal ethnicity, and education. Also controlled for fasting hours, so how many hours the kids would have fasted because we had all of their blood panel work. So when we're looking at their blood lipids, we wanted to control for all of those, because we essentially wanted to see that if we regressed all of those out and we kind of had ageless or sexless data or genderless data, were the relationships that we were seeing, or the associations rather that we were seeing, were they true? Were they not confounded by some of these other things because of, say, age? And the reason, and this is, one kind of piece of advice I would have whenever you're selecting what your covariates are or your confounders. One, it can become a slippery slope that you end up feeling like you're going to control for every single thing. And so sometimes you run into that thing of, are we controlling for too much? The second thing is that when you're building out your conceptual model in terms of what your exposure is, your outcome, what you're going to be controlling for, as well as, you have your potential mediators or effect modifiers, but is really thinking, where they fall on the causal pathway, and that whatever you select to control for, I would encourage you to ensure that it's something that can be informed by or backed up by literature. So, for example, the reason, I chose something such as sex, for example, is that there's a long-standing, it's been long established that there is a difference on children's physical activity levels based on their sex and gender. And so, we know that boys tend to be more active, at least in the early years, tend to be more active and less sedentary compared to their female counterparts. And so it was important to control for that. Same with, age. We know that as we age, our activity levels tend to decrease. So want to control for that. And again, part of it is because we are taking that temporal examination. So looking at that, fasting hours, of course, because we have all of these lipids, and also looking in terms of, do these variables that you're controlling for, do they impact both your exposure and your outcome? Do they are they just associated to one and you're controlling for? And is there justification to show that also sex and age are also known to modify or impact, the outcome of cardiometabolic risk? And so that's why really relying on the literature to see where are there already these established kind of correlates or impacts, and what have other similar studies done in terms of what did they control for. And so I think that's like a good piece of advice, and one that I've tried to make sure that when I'm listing out or choosing out which variables I want to enter into my conceptual model to control for, that there's some sort of evidence-backed rationale for why I'm including it or not including it. Again, I think this is good for you when you're building out the best models you can, but in terms of getting feedback from maybe a committee or when it goes out for publication for peer review, is again having that rationale for why you selected to have something entered or not entered. And then again, being aware of the fact that it can sometimes be a slippery slope, that sometimes I've definitely started building my model and I now have like 14 covariates. I'm trying to think, do I really need all of these? We have things such as, maternal ethnicity and education level. We know that those are both important influential factors when it comes to both activity or movement behaviors of young kids, but also in terms of cardiometabolic, understanding that. But then I've also had questions or pushback on, why don't you just have parental ethnicity or parental education, or both mothers and fathers? And so having that rationale for, why did I only have female? And sometimes it can be because most often the ones in our cases who complete the studies are mothers. And so sometimes it's a pure fact of, I don't have the father's information. So I'm unable to enter what the impacts of paternal that, or sometimes depending on the exposures or the variables you're most interested in that association, maybe there's really only something to show that it's really just driven by paternal or maternal. And so that's why it's important to, I think sometimes we kind of haphazardly just control for the same things because we think we should, or that's what everyone else does, so we're going to do it too. But especially when you start to move beyond the kind of quick go-to such as age and sex or gender, I think that's where you want to be really purposeful with what you're entering or excluding. So I don't know if that's also been a similar practice, or if that's what you do, if there's any other things you like to consider when you're building that out. But
yeah, I completely agree. So, one of the advantages of cohort study design and using the cohort data is that we get lots of data, right? We have all the demographic information that we need and all the behaviors and health outcomes. So it's basically up to a researcher which one to choose. And that's why you have to select covariates, exposure outcomes, backed up by evidence, right? But, when we look at physical activity, for example, there is a little, but still there's an evidence suggesting that, girls' physical activity is more influenced by mom's physical activity levels, whereas for boys, it's dead, right? So we need both parental data. That'll be perfect. But because people just collect data on moms, so we don't have data about movement behaviors among fathers of young children. So yeah, I think it's really important that we have to be mindful and purposeful when we design our study or cohort survey.
For sure. And I think, you raise another point that, if someone, ideally we want to have, both parents reporting, at least, in this case, what we're dealing with young kids. And so again, doing a cohort study has really allowed us we noticed that this was a recurring issue that was coming up. And by now I will say, starting in like 2017, even before I joined the team at Sick Kids, is that now it's been incorporated that they're asking both parents as much as possible that they complete it. So moving forward from 2017, we're now in 4 years since that addition and plan to continue forward. We're going to be able to make those kind of inferences, or at least include those. But again, it goes back to that limitation, is that we're only going to be able to include paternal information from, unless if they were the ones who filled it out from the get-go, but then we might not have, maternal. Or again, it really depends too, is that especially in Canada, what was when this target kids, at least when the cohort was first established, what defines a family in Canada has changed so much. And so it's also, we're not always going to get, for a number of different reasons, a mom and a dad filling it out. It's just, that's not representative of Canadian families, and especially, Toronto being that primary hub, but now we've extended into Kingston, Edmonton, as well as Montreal. This target kid study is that this is not necessarily represented. So sometimes it's going to be the two parents, or sometimes we have some kids that, were in foster care, or their grandparents are now taking care of them. And so, it's really like, is it parental influence, or is it that authority figure that's, most present in their life? And so it does, lend itself to quite, you can really get as complex or not. And it really depends on what you're looking at and what you're interested in. But I think, again, the beauty of having, you kind of get another kick at the can, because you're continuously collecting that same data moving forward, but always keeping in mind that there are some limitations, as that for some things, I might not be able to reach back all the way to 2009 to use the data if the variable, the way even we ask a question has changed. Like even physical activity, some of the questions was just like, is your kid active? Yes, no. And now, it's more so like, well, when are they active? What type of activity? What intensity? Is it indoors or outdoors? And so, over time, we've been able to glean and get more specific as the research has evolved. But, that's something to always think about, is that there's a limitation in terms of how far back can I go if the question itself has started to change. Am I really comparing apples to apples?
Yeah, and you've raised a really important point. Our society is constantly changing, especially in Canada, Toronto. So yeah, what makes up a family is now different. It's different than what we traditionally thought it would be. So one of the disadvantages associated with cohort study design is that we have to constantly update the survey items, right? So beforehand, let's say like in 1980s, we asked, mom's education level and dad's education levels. Right now, if we ask the same question, we may have, or we must change the wording for that too, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's something that we're running into, and we see even like some larger national level ones, some that are being, say ran through StatsCan or something. Like it's not something uncommon that we're not encountering. And it's always that fine line in terms of, this question isn't necessarily reflective, or it's not really getting at what we want to get at, but how do you tweak it in a way that hopefully won't exclude all the past data that we have? So sometimes it has to be a complete change, and then it kind of makes like, well, I mean, maybe we can kind of retrofit some things that we can still kind of glean something and use it, or maybe, we're going to have to only look at kind of subsets or segment what we're looking at, or sometimes, it still could be salvageable depending on how much we change. But you're absolutely right in that the questions we ask, how we're asking, the tools that we use, maybe at one point this questionnaire was the best thing in terms of assessing young children's activities, and now we have them wearing accelerometers. So it's great because all the data now is objective, and it's a much more reliable and valid measure using accelerometry with young children's activity. But what happens to the previous like 10 years of data that we had that was questionnaire, and it's it was a valid questionnaire at the time, and it still is. It continues to be used. And so one way that we've continued is that we never stopped asking the questions about physical activity. We kept those going, so we at least had that continuous stream. But now, just again, from 2013, we've had accelerometry data in addition to that. So depending on what we're looking at, sometimes we might utilize both. Sometimes we might, since we do have some established reliability between the two, I would say it could be stronger between that, but there lends itself to that. But depending on what it is, we'll usually always gravitate towards the objective data rather than the questionnaire data, just because of some of the inherent limitations when it comes to physical activity and screen use, in terms of bias and under or overestimating activity levels. But that's an example where we've tried to kind of minimize the blow and not just exclude it completely. And where it might be okay or, permissible or forgivable to rely on more of a proxy report than an objective measure.
Yeah. So in your paper, you've outlined a number of limitations associated with your study design. Can you just mention one of them and what that was and how you would have done differently, if you can?
Yes. So that example specifically, because it was done with screen use when I first started, with physical activity. They really wanted to look at that impact on, they had been collecting all of this movement data for so long, but they didn't necessarily have someone to dig in and analyze. And so because we were looking from 3 to 12 years and we wanted to include all the data that they had, they ended up wanting to use the questionnaire data for the physical activity. So it is a valid questionnaire. It's off of the GPAC. It's the same that the Canadian Health Measures Survey uses. So it's a readily used tool. And there is some, the psychometrics are okay, like decent in terms of that's your only thing. Now, at this point, we also had accelerometry data, but not for that extended period of time. So, and especially being a physical activity researcher where all my stuff was using objective measures, never a questionnaire, it was a bit personally painful to go through that data because part of me was like, I wouldn't use this. But in order to answer the question that we were looking at, it was sufficient to do that. But I would say that ended up being a limitation because we didn't necessarily find some of the associations that maybe what we were hoping for or had anticipated based on other previously published work. Granted, part of it could be the young age of the kids, is that sometimes with cardiometabolic risk, at 3, are we really starting to see some strong trends emerging? For sure, there are some cases where 2-year-olds already start to show signs of atherosclerosis, or plaque buildup. So for sure there's some, but this is working with a typically healthy population. So we wouldn't necessarily see. So one thing, was it just too young to see some of those change or those trends emerging? Or is it because the tool that we were using, in this case, so proxy report, so parent reported physical activity levels, maybe just weren't sensitive enough for us to really determine whether there was a true association between physical activity and the cardiometabolic risk factors that we were looking at. And one of the main limitations, for those of you that don't know, is sometimes using questionnaires, especially around movement behaviors, is that parents notoriously overestimate how active they think their kids are and underestimate how sedentary they are or how much time they watch screens. And so that could be another thing in terms of why it was important to note that as a limitation, because, despite having, 9 years worth of data from these same kids that we were able to look at all that, there was an association. So we're stuck with, it could be that there really isn't an association during that period. That's one thing. But we can't necessarily say that for certainty because we don't know if maybe something that was maybe playing a role is the choice of tool. And so in terms of looking at a limitation and kind of highlighting some future directions would be to repeat that study, running a similar study, but rather than using parent reported or proxy reported physical activity levels would be to actually draw on more objective measures. So from an accelerometer, and looking at that, which is what since we've been doing. But that's an example of, if we only took the objective data at that point, we would have only had maybe 100 participants that we would have been able to include. And so it made more sense in a much stronger study to actually utilize, 2,000 cases, but using a survey.
Okay. So if you used objective measure of physical activity for this study, at least you can eliminate using subjective measures to measure PA as a potential reason. Yeah.
Exactly. And, it's very possible that we could rerun this study and find the exact same thing. But for those reasons that you just said, at least we'd be maybe more confident in some of the claims that we would make. Yeah. And that, seems that 3, physical activity doesn't play a huge role in determining whether or not a child at 12 is going to have, increased risk for cardiometabolic issues. At least we feel more confident. It's just we couldn't say with exact certainty, or again, going back to that whole causality thing, if that was the case, and is it because is this lack of an association true, or is it due to maybe our choice of tool?
Yeah, very important point. We've been covering in our epidemiology course that causality is basically established based on our confidence, and building that confidence, its replication, its consistency, its strength, and its temporality. Also, the use of measures that we do. Yeah. All right. Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. So I think we've covered cohort studies pretty well. Before we finish, is there anything that you want to say to our students?
Yeah, I mean, my thing, it's not going to be cohort study related.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
More questions about that, you can reach out via email.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me is that when you went to grad school, like you didn't plan it, and you didn't know, what the grad school is about, and now you're, doing so well using your skills and knowledge. So it'd be nice to hear from you.
Yeah, so that kind of like on that route, it was going to be like this idea of like perseverance and just kind of moving forward with that. I think, and again, this isn't to put myself down. It's more so that I was never, and I'm okay with that, I was never going to necessarily be like that smartest person in the room all the time. I knew that even though, and I thought like I was a strong student, but I knew that even if I had that 92, there's someone that has the 94, the 95, the 98. And I had to learn to become okay with being like, you know what, I'm not going to be that 98 student, but that's okay. And I don't have to be to still be very successful and accomplished with what I do. But one thing that I think sometimes isn't hampered home a lot, I think, especially when you're in undergrad and in university, that you're always chasing after that next thing that, you start to get used to. It's never enough. And that, you can easily start to be like, oh, it's only 92. What happened to the other 80%? And what I found is, very much just trying to it's just persevere. I think sometimes those softer skills aren't always embraced or encouraged as much, or at least that's what we feel like we're not hearing. And maybe in fact, we do have a lot of people in our lives that are saying like, you did your best, you at least tried, you took your shot. But I would say that one of the biggest things that's probably led to my success and why I've been able to secure a number of, different research awards or publish or be able to do what I have been able to do is because I've at least always tried, and that I've always just tried to keep putting those steps forward in terms of like, okay, why didn't it maybe land perfectly that time? And how can I course correct? How can I improve next time around? So I would say, persevere. And the second thing would be probably around this idea of, how do I perfectly word this? But I think it's like around one of those things of just not kind of losing sight of kind of like yourself throughout wherever you're kind of going forward. I think, and again, maybe being very type A, is that I very quickly learned that my identity was so tightly tied to me being a student. And I felt that the minute I kind of lost that, you're no longer a student, you're now entering into the professional world, which many of you, after you finish your undergrad, is that, all you've known is what it's been like to be a student. And I found that that was quite jarring for me, even though thinking like, this is great. I'm obviously a functioning adult. Like, you've been living your life all the way through. But I did find that kind of being a transition into like, I'm no longer Leigh the student, I'm now Leigh the professional, and having all of these additional expectations, or not having this idea of like, maybe because when I could say I was a student, people were still like, oh, well, it's okay. Like, she's just a student, or it's, and for whatever, for better or for worse. But I did find that like a bit of a transition. And so I think it's just like, kind of like, quiet your mind, allow yourself to kind of go through those moments, those experiences, and that, before you know it, you're going to be looking back and thinking like, what was I worried about? But I think just, being kind to yourself and giving yourself time to transition. So yeah, the whole perseverance point is just keep trying. It's okay if you don't get it perfect the first time. Embrace constructive criticism. I will add that in, that there's always going to be people that are saying things, and I don't mean those naysayers. I don't mean the people that are trying to bring you down. But I mean, even your profs or anyone in life, you're not going to get it perfect every single time. There are going to be things you have to improve, and you can't grow if you don't get some of these things pointed out to you. And if you want to be that top notch in whatever field you end up being, you're going to have to be able to take that criticism, but use that as ammunition to get that much better. Because once they point it out once, it's going to be unlikely that you're going to do it again. When something gets pointed out. So I still, to this day, in fact, I question if I get a paperback or some sort of grant back and there's few edits and they're like, oh, great job. It makes me think they didn't actually take the time to read through it, because I know it's like, well, it's not a completely perfect paper. I know there's things, and but I know when I look at my writing back to when I was an undergrad to now, how much it's immensely improved. And that's because I've had that time to look at it and ensure I'm not going to do it. So the perseverance, embrace criticism, and just be kind and gentle. Just give yourself that time to transition, and you're going to develop that whole new identity in whatever that might be, whether it's becoming a parent, whether it's now, you're a young professional, whether you're, traveling, whatever. Taking that break is, I think, just allowing yourself to, it's okay. You don't need to have this perfectly boxed off identity of what that means. And I mean, even someone like myself, who I really thought I could not have paved out things better for myself, even still, I went from a student and literally had 2 days before I then was like this young professional career woman in the big city, we'll say, like in Toronto. And I still felt like, what am I doing? I don't know who I am. This whole imposter syndrome thing. All I wanted was, I couldn't wait to have my weekends and my evenings back, to not have to do homework or studying. And then I found myself being like, what do I do now? I don't have those things anymore to fill my time. And so really reintegrating to like, my nights are my own now. My weekends are my own. I can go back to just fully enjoying and embracing time with my friends and family, and going out and doing the sports that I used to do. So I think those would be my big 3 take home as you start to, you'll be getting to that transition point yourself sooner rather than later. And so just trying, those would be my biggest pieces of advice, having gone through that about 3 years ago now. So
yeah. Wow. I think I have to say that was the best take home messages in this interview series.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I hope you can all learn from my mistakes, which I didn't know when I left. And I was like, no, this is what I thought it's going to be like.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that, Dr. Vanderloo, and thanks for coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.